Our final speaker of this morning is Madeleine Fidell-Beaufort, whose academic training includes a Master in Fine Arts from Yale University and a doctorate from New York University's Institute of Fine Arts. She wrote her dissertation on the graphic art of Charles-François d'Aubigny. That research and her curiosity about why so many of d'Aubigny's paintings were in American collections led Madeleine to the discovery of Samuel Avery's travel diaries in manuscript form at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Avery's granddaughters and their grandniece encouraged her to edit those diaries, and a research fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities permitted further study of Avery's career. She and her co-author, Jean Welsher and Herbert Kleinfield, published the edited diaries that cover the years 1871 to 1882, and they published them in 1979. Madeleine further researched Avery's auctions in 1981 as a senior visiting fellow at CASVA at the National Gallery of Art. She also received an American Council of Learned Societies grant that enabled her to focus further on Avery's American correspondence. Articles that grew out of this research have been published in the Oxford Art Journal and the Van Gogh Museum Journal, as well as in volumes of essays, The Commerce of Art in the Renaissance to Our Time, the artwork through the market and the past and present. And so now, with this background, steeped in the remarkable career of Samuel Avery, whom we've been hearing about yesterday and today, we now will have him as the centerpiece of the next talk, Samuel P. Avery as an agent, dealer, and expert in building American collections. Please welcome Madeleine Beaufort.
Good afternoon. I want to thank Linda and the remarkable staff of the library and the people who are organizing this exhibition, this lecture. Anyway, I will start and we'll see whether I can get through what too much information. So my goal today is to talk about circumstances leading to Samuel Avery's success as an art agent, an art dealer, and an art expert. Essentially, he was a wood engraver, and he was very busy in, oops. Sure, I can get it.
What happened? It's my fault. You have to use a different one of the clickers.
Sorry. Thank you. Okay. He was a wood engraver, and it favored what he originally called dabbling in art. His office was in Lower Manhattan, where art auction rooms, art galleries, exhibitions, artist studios were located. And here in his business card, he explains in a very concise way, which is fairly typical of his written style, that he can execute at short notice and on reasonable terms engravings in any genre, paintings and views of buildings. It goes on. He can do anything. On the right is Thomas Farr's Avery at his desk. This is actually a reproduction. The original seems to have disappeared. What I wanted to point out was that on the walls, you will see many paintings or drawings that were made by artists who were his collaborators. He had all of these framed images. It's hard to know whether this was the beginning of his collection or whether these were things that were part of his scrapbook, which he was making, as were others who were associated with the Century Club. They took scraps and autograph material and made them into albums, and I'll talk about these in a minute. Here is one. Oh, this is essentially where his various studios were located, but you can see he didn't go very far. He stayed around Nassau Street, Center Street, Broadway, City Hall Park, and one of the things that is rather interesting is that he lived in Manhattan until a point where he and his wife, who we married in 1847, moved to Brooklyn. And essentially it was in Brooklyn that, it was in Brooklyn, he took the ferry, Fulton Street ferry. It took about 12 minutes to get across the river, and it would cost very, very little. What happened also was that he provided these sketches or scraps, as sometimes are called, for William T. Walters, who lived and worked in Baltimore, and he relied on Avery to obtain small sketches for his scrapbook from artists living in the New York area. This is George Augustus Baker, who wrote to Avery in January of 1860 to say that the little head for Walters was not yet ready. Baker made this sketch in preparation for a larger work. So we have Avery moving to Brooklyn, where he worked for 20 years, and he was in contact with many members of the Brooklyn Cultural Associations. It was to his home in Brooklyn that he invited people to what he called art evenings. I will get back to this in a moment, but I want to show you what's typical of Avery's first auctions. This is a painting by James Hart, originally called Sunday Afternoon. It is, well, no, I'm sorry, it was originally called Sunday Morning. Many of the paintings or most all of the paintings in Avery's auction catalogs are, in fact, without dimensions. There's no size. And this is difficult then to locate the paintings, which also change their titles. So to begin with, an art collector from Troy, New York, named Irving Brown, wrote to Avery on January 4th, 1861, asking to borrow Hart's landscape for the 4th annual exhibition at the Troy Young Men's Association. Avery had already helped Brown to borrow paintings from previous exhibitions from various art collectors. Avery then furnished this picture, which he actually had owned, and that the title changed later. Fortunately, the landscape was purchased by William Hayes Fogg, a China trader, and Fogg lived in Manhattan when he bought the picture at an auction of Avery's own collection in 1867. The auction catalog, as I said, has no indication of the size of this picture, and it was Fogg's wife who eventually donated the picture to Harvard. It's a small cabinet or parlor-sized picture that was like many of the pictures in the early Avery auction catalogs. The price that Fogg paid for the picture was $305. Not a great deal of money compared to auction prices today, but looking back on early auctions later, Avery explained that buyers at his first auctions were afraid to be seen in public spending over $400 or $500 on one picture. They thought they would lose their reputation for being sensible businessmen, and some picked up the attitude that art was important because of patriotic associations, causes that had to do with charitable reasons. I show you quickly this graph of auction sales. Commercial art auctions featuring works of art were very rare before the Civil War, but as you can see, dramatically increased afterwards. Fortunes after the Civil War grew with tremendous speed and were matched with an impulse to spend, and so collections grew rapidly. And after 1876, the sale of 2 art collections were sold at what was observed were a great profit. That was of John Taylor Johnson and John Stryker Jenkins, and it led to the belief that art was a sound investment and paintings would increase in value. Newspapers began to carry reports about art auctions with the names of buyers, and in the late 1870s, a very specialized group of art periodicals began publication and provided information about art, artists, and art collectors. I show you this picture, which has popped up several times, but I do want to point out that it has been dedicated to Avery and was actually done in Brooklyn. It's 1863, and it says Brooklyn there. Charles Loring Elliott was an extremely adored painter by Avery. And he died in 1868, and Avery created a kind of committee to donate a portrait bust of Charles Loring Elliott to in his name, and you'll see a little bit later something more about him. These are some of the engravings that Avery did of American artists who he appreciated. I think he was trying to create a series of them, again, for commercial reasons. I show you here a picture by a photograph, an anonymous photograph, that talks about and I want to talk about the fact that essentially the artist J.G. Brown and William Hart are in this picture. J.G. Brown stated very late after Avery's death that he had many, many pleasant memories of Avery, especially of being invited to an art evening at Avery's home on Clinton Avenue in Brooklyn, where Brown was introduced to local artists. Brown said he had never met any of the artists before, nor had he ever seen so many pictures in a private house. He said every available space in the room was used, and some work was hanging on doors. Brown said that Avery was the first dealer who bought little pictures of children for his friends. So letters to Avery in the 1850s and 60s from American artists thanked him for favors like lending them photographs, stereoptic and views related to what they were painting, and Avery even commissioned for himself small paintings directly from artists like John Kensett and William Sidney Mount. I am going to show you next a portrait, as you see, of William T. Walters. And William T. Walters then moved to Paris during the Civil War. He decided to sell part of his collection, and he asked Samuel Avery to organize an auction for him in New York. To do so, Avery worked with an auctioneer named Henry Leeds. The auction took place on April 9, 1864, and Avery made the engraving for his the title page and actually put his own name in there. This is the very beginning of the auction. It is a start for Avery's long career as an art expert. He was soon to become an art dealer as well. So I want to go back one. So this is the calling card for, actually it's not the first gallery that Avery had. Walters provided money for Avery to open a gallery, and Avery was then able to sell pictures either at auction or at the gallery that he opened in 1865. The announcement of Avery's gallery was accompanied by 48 signatures of by American artists who were probably looking forward to having Avery sell their work. The auction of Avery's own collection is something that took place because it was in preparation for his leaving for Europe, where he hoped to buy paintings. He had just learned that he would be in charge of the American Arts section at the 1867 Universal Exhibition in Paris. So Avery sold the contents of his library along with the famous scrapbook sketches by American artists that he had been working on for 15 years. I show you then a photo of George Lucas. He was an engineer from Baltimore who arrived in Paris in the 1850s and remained in France until his death in 1909. Lucas frequented the Hotel Drouot, annual salons, art galleries. He knew contemporary European art very well and its prices. So Walters introduced Avery to Lucas, and they formed a sort of team. As early as November 1865, well before Avery came to Paris, or went to Paris, Avery wrote to Lucas to commission a painting by Bouguereau for a Baltimore collector named John Stryker Jenkins. It was a large painting of art and literature intended for a specific place in Jenkins' library. Lucas reported that the picture would not be ready for a year and a half and would cost 8,000 francs, about $1,200. By July 1866, Bouguereau was able to show Lucas a sketch for the painting, but the picture would now cost 12,000 francs because Jenkins later sent a tracing of the place in his library where it was hung, which was larger than he indicated. In fact, this picture was not ready until February of 1868, and when it was finished, Lucas had a photograph made of it, which he asked, or had photographs made of it, and he asked Bouguereau to sign on the back or on the front, I'm not sure where. But it was proof of the authenticity of art and literature. Lucas had a case constructed for Jenkins' art and literature. He shipped it directly to Baltimore on a steamer leaving from Liverpool. It had taken actually 3 years for Bouguereau to paint the picture, but Jenkins was absolutely delighted with the final result because he could say that the picture was painted expressly for him. George Lucas on the right is a very special photograph by a photographer who was also a sculptor, who we'll see in a minute also photographed Avery. He photographed John Taylor Johnson and several other people. Lucas's diaries suggest how helpful he was in creating, or in helping Avery actually to bring his paintings or pictures that were delivered to the exhibition site, to have them delivered to the exhibition site. Lucas helped having the paintings unwrapped, and he helped Avery to get the paintings hung. What you're seeing on the extreme right is the American section, the Universal Exhibition building, which was quite unique, was in fact created in concentric circles. The exterior part was for machinery, and it was towards the center that the American and other galleries were actually there. As soon as the exhibition opened, and there were problems with getting pictures, the American artists had decided that they would not send their work to Paris because they were afraid that the U.S. government would not pay for returning their pictures, and they were very reluctant to send their work abroad. A few American collectors stepped in, and they lent paintings that they already owned. It was a small group of paintings, and essentially a small sample, considering that there were 400 American artists working in New York, Baltimore, Boston, and Philadelphia. The work sent was usually not the most recent, and the space allotted at the end of the British Gallery was not optimal. The passage was constantly crowded, and the lower tiers of paintings were hung in poorly lit spaces. As soon as, back again. As soon as Avery hung the exhibition. He was able to proceed with Lucas and learn more about European paintings. But I show you John Taylor Johnson, first president of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the picture that Avery sold him, which is now in the Metropolitan, and Prisoners from the Front. The painting that also is loaned by John Taylor Johnson was painted in 1857 and was 10 years old by the time it was exhibited. Essentially, it was awarded a silver medal, the only prize that an American painter got. And it was silver, not gold. It was worth about $100. And it was fairly clear that French art critics were not impressed by American landscape painting, but they did like American nature. American genre and figure painting were not considered to be worth looking at either. So the critics were highly critical, and I think what happened essentially is American collectors began to look at European work only because they thought that it might be a better investment. Here is another picture that was lent by a collector, and essentially this picture lent by George Whitney is rather fascinating because of the association with the Civil War. Letters that Avery sent and received from Whitney during his buying trips later show that George Whitney, a dedicated art collector, was actually also providing financial backing for Avery in term of money that he would send Avery to buy paintings that evidently Avery would then send or sell or get for Lucas. Wealth generated by the Civil War meant that Americans were well able to afford more expensive and much larger academic paintings. When artists had their work accepted by the Salon jury in Paris, they earned an automatic seal of approval. So American art buyers believed that art from abroad would be a better investment than buying American art. Here we have Avery, who's a little squished in the corner. Again, same photographer, Adam Solomon. This one is dated 1872. You see Avery at the age of 50. He was quite sophisticated. He bought his clothes in London on annual trips abroad. In 1868, he returned to the U.S. after the Universal Exhibition, and he was invited to join the Union League Club, where he worked on the art committee, which organized monthly exhibitions of art from its members themselves. Once the Civil War was over, the Union League Club began working on civic projects, and the Union League Club was active in founding of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In 1872, Avery was made a trustee, and it was a position he occupied until his death in 1904. I show you a sort of graph of all of the auctions that Avery held, and what I wanted to show you is that about 55% of the people who were buying paintings attended only one auction. But it did not mean that there were no important collectors in this group. In December of 1866, an auction, a buyer from Baltimore, a dry goods merchant named B.F. Gardner, bought 10 American paintings and paid high prices for them. Artists like John Frederick Kensett attended 6 auctions, buying 15 paintings, 6 American and 9 European, until he didn't buy after 1872. Another artist, George Henry Hall, also attended 6 auctions, buying 8 American paintings, 15 European paintings, and James Abner Harper attended 7 auctions, buying 1 American painting and 11 European works. One further person of interest was Robert Gordon, a banker and Metropolitan Museum of trustee and sometimes treasurer. He bought at 7 auctions 14 paintings. The little tiny one way over on the right represents one man who went to 10 auctions, and that was John Taylor Johnson. He bought 31 paintings, which is rather amazing. I show you 3 people who were essentially very active in buying paintings. Samuel Avery found important clients thanks to his artist friends. A letter to Cyrus McCormick effectively was something that Avery wrote in 1866, telling McCormick that his friend Erastus Dow Palmer, a sculptor, had written to ask Avery to make sure that Palmer's bust of McCormick's wife would be safely delivered, and Palmer told McCormick that he might want to consult with Avery about a pedestal. So Avery wrote to McCormick and said he had in his rooms a very beautiful pedestal that he could send home to McCormick with the bust. The idea is that McCormick actually, the inventor of the Reaper, had a New York residence. He bought 5 European paintings at an Avery auction in 1868 and paid almost $2,000 for them. Afterwards, Avery sent clippings to McCormick about various things that he thought would be of interest. The man at the extreme right, Edwin Dennison Morgan, a leading New York merchant who became the 21st governor of New York State and later served as a U.S. senator, is seen here in a picture that is one of many, many portraits of Morgan, and one of these portraits, another portrait, which I've never found, was painted by Charles Loring Elliott, who painted perhaps 700 portraits. And he was one of Avery's dearest friends, as I've mentioned before. Avery crossed the Atlantic frequently. In this case, he's seen transporting the little sail that has the names of people whose whose paintings he bought. I think it's not, the names are not really reflecting what Avery also painted. He bought paintings by other people. It doesn't show any of the artists who are really the best known. One of the other things that I think is rather fascinating are all these cases marked porcelain, because they're of interest. Certain of Avery's clients requested that Avery buy for them chandeliers, gas lighting fixtures, enamel plaques, even dresses and bonnets for their wives. Bric-a-brac was in fashion, and Avery was very happy to visit antique stores, mainly, it seems to me, in Belgium and the Netherlands, where he was happy to find rare pieces for special clients. I show you here a painting of the Vanderbilt family by a guy who seems to have done several more paintings of collectors and their families. You see on the extreme left, William Henry Vanderbilt seated in this picture that I'm showing it to you because he bought paintings at 5 auctions that Avery ran, 3 European and only 5 American paintings. He and Avery sailed to Europe when it was clear that Vanderbilt was inheriting a great deal of money. They went on the steamship Britannic in April of 1878. They were in London by May 8th, visiting the Royal Academy exhibition and dealers. They went on to France and in Paris. Vanderbilt bought paintings at the Salon. They went to Goupil's gallery. He visited Jerome's studio, and by May 22nd, Vanderbilt had seen Messonnier and ordered a picture of an artist to be finished in 1879. Vanderbilt gave Avery £1,000 for his services, and the end of June, Vanderbilt wrote to Avery, "My visit to the different artists affords me a very good subject of conversation. I am delighted with the whole trip." Once the new house that he built was finished and the paintings he had commissioned arrived, Vanderbilt wrote Avery gleefully that no one but his family knew about the arrival of his treasures. He was waiting for Avery to tell him where paintings should be hung. Working with Vanderbilt placed Avery in an ambiguous social situation. He was neither a servant nor a friend, but he did state publicly that Vanderbilt would buy no painting that he did not like. Clearly, another sort of relationship was between Robert Gordon and his family. Here is another guy painting. Gordon, then a banker and fellow trustee at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, eventually became a neighbor when Avery moved to East 38th Street in Manhattan. He bought, I think I mentioned, paintings at 7 of Avery's auctions, and you can see on the right wall what a collection of these parlor or cabinet paintings looked like. They are very small pictures, and they have rather large frames, so it looked like quite a lot. Anyway, Avery stopped organizing independent auctions at the end of 1881, but he continued to manage sales of collections of former clients. And this was the case with Morgan's collection, which was sold in 1886. In conclusion, Avery's unusual expertise and remarkable contact with American artists, collectors, and art dealers and artisans throughout Europe and England provided a level of service that was difficult to find elsewhere. Avery, like Lucas and Walters, was a man of few words, but he was able to project an image of being a reliable, honest, and eager promoter of art. He was able to earn himself a comfortable living, as well as donating money to Columbia University for the Avery Library. And he also gave 22,000 prints to the New York Public Library and established a print room there. So there you have his career in a kind of nutshell.